Comics will break your heart, kid. Or at least that's what Jack Kirby is famous for saying. Now, before I tell this story, I want to be very clear. This is not an indictment against Marvel Comics or Marvel as a company or anything like that. If anything, this should serve as an example to anybody who's looking to get into comics, to kind of manage your expectations, how to be professional, and just how to show up in a very organized manner, not just for the company that you're working for, but also for yourself. Make sense? All right, let's get into it. So, way back in the distant lands of 2011, I was in my final year of college and I had the opportunity to do a free elective, which I could turn into an internship. And I chose to throw my hat in the ring to intern at Marvel Comics. Now, I live in North Jersey, which has a interesting symbiotic relationship with New York City. We're very close to it. So I said to myself, I said, well, Marvel holds these internships year round and summertime's coming up. How cool would it be to intern at Marvel Comics? Now, I've been a Marvel Comics fan for quite a long time at this point. So having the place, the house of ideas so near to me that I could just travel there was a huge possibility. I had to throw my hat in the ring. So I did so, threw my resume out there, got a hit back, got a call for an interview with three different departments at Marvel, and one department in particular decided to pick me up, and that was the editorial department in the X-Men office. I refrain from using the editors' names. They're all really, really cool people. I think two of which still work at Marvel, so shout out to you guys. But when I got accepted, I was over the moon. I was super, super happy, almost like a little kid. I was a child, like mentally at least. I was like, yeah, I got into Marvel. I got into Marvel. But with that excitement and that overzealousness came a little bit of uh, naivety, I would say. So what I mean by that is, when I got to Marvel and I interned, it was one of those things where you kind of walk into the building and you expect, statues and toys everywhere and people dressed up in, cosplay outfits. At least that was me. I'm very weird. I had this weird idea of what Marvel Comics HQ would look like. And then when I got there, it was just a normal business office, just, people working in cubicles, very quiet, people just kind of, shooting a breeze with one another at the water cooler, things like that. But when I actually got the offer to do the internship, I press upon myself a weird expectation. So, a little bit about me. I'm a storyteller. I always have been since I was a child. And that is in large part why this internship meant a lot to me. And I told myself that, hey, Josh, if you go into this internship and if you do not get an offer to be a Marvel writer, you have failed, you're a failure. So, right off the bat, I already set a very high bar for myself, unknowingly so, putting myself in a really bad position. So, my internship starts. The editors are really nice to me, really, really cool. They even let me sit in the office. They had really, really small offices back in 2011. Maybe they increased now, or maybe they will increase with Marvel moving over to California. Wink, wink. But these office spaces that the editors worked in was really, really small. And so they actually gave me the opportunity to sit inside the office in the corner next to the bookcase just to, hear them talk about the books all day, which was really, really cool. And that was really nice of them to do. Um, so I sat there day in, day out, listen to the editors talk to artists, listening to them talk to writers, redo scripts, a whole bunch of stuff. So one day, one of the editors gave me a task to reformat one of the scripts. He gave me a copy of the script for a book that hadn't even come out yet, probably wasn't going to come out for a couple of months. And I wasn't the most like literally savvy person to re-edit the script. So long story short, I messed it up. I completely fumbled it. And I submitted it to him, via email. And as I was walking around doing my rounds, I kind of heard him say in the office, like, Josh kind of messed the script up. Then it's before he seen me or before I got back in the office, and I was crushed. I was like, oh man, my first task, and I failed. It was just horrible. So I decided to dust myself off, move forward. Then my next task was to write the forward, kind of like, I don't know the actual term for it, but the little bracket inside the comic book that tells you what the previous issue was about. So I believe it was I don't know if it was Uncanny X-Men book or something like that, but the editor said, "Hey, just read the books and write some forewords about what's had taken place in the previous issue." So this was my first, again, being overzealous, being a kid who's just like, "Hey, I get to write something about Marvel Comics in Marvel Comics and present it to a Marvel Comics editor. I'm in. Let's do it." So I read the issues, wrote a foreword for it, and put my all into it. The editor read it and he said, "Not bad. It's pretty good. Thank you," and just walked away. And of course my brain, I'm like, "Oh, that's my shot. I'm definitely going to be a writer now." The editor loved my recap of the previous 4 issues, so now they're going to trust me to write an entire story, right? Wrong. But again, that's why I'm saying, like, having manage your expectations when you're doing things like this is paramount, because you don't want to end up disappointed. You don't want to gain a false sense of reality. You also don't want to overstep as well. But that particular instance, I felt really, really accomplished, that the editor just read my work and thought that my writing was slightly competent, which was good. And as the internship continued, I would sit in the bullpen with the other interns and talk to them and just see, what were their aspirations, what were their hopes for being in the internship. And a lot of them just said, "Hey, I liked comics. I don't really want to be a writer. I just wanted to see what Marvel Comics, had to offer just in terms of jobs." And to be honest, like, a lot of them were thinking very pragmatically to their respects. They were thinking, "Hey, like, if I move out to New York from my Midwest state, I can perhaps get a job as an assistant editor, or, somebody who works in a completely different department that had nothing at all to do with the comic books." And I hadn't even thought about that. A lot of the kids who were interning there were thinking from, like I said, a very pragmatic standpoint. Like, they just wanted a job when they got out of college. Me, I just wanted to be a writer. I was like, hand me the lowest character you can possibly find, and I'll write the best story. And that leads me to my next instance that broke my heart. So one of the editors one day walked into the X-Men office. There were both, it was 2 X-Men offices at the time. And they came in and they were talking about this comic book called Brute Force and how ridiculous it was. Now, if you look up Brute Force is a comic book about anthropomorphic animals. I believe one of them is a dolphin, one of them is a kangaroo, the other one's like a monkey or something like that. It's a very bizarre comic book. And it only had a 4 issue series in the 80s, I believe. And they were just saying how ridiculous the comic book was, but how much of a gas it would be to revamp this comic. And that happened a lot of times. Like, a lot of times the editors will jump into each other's offices and just kind of bounce ideas off each other, which I thought was pretty cool. But in this particular instance, the editor was kind of taking it serious, like, "Hey, like, this would be pretty cool if we can take Brute Force and pitch it to, our superiors and get the book greenlit." So my brain sitting in the corner, I'm like, "Yeah, this is my opportunity. This is my opportunity to pitch Marvel editors on Brute Force." Again, I didn't even know what the heck Brute Force was at the time. They didn't have any copies of it in their library, so I took to the internet, bought the entire 4 issue series on eBay, got it in about 2 days, brought it into the offices along with a treatment. Now, at the time, I didn't know this, but Marvel comic book editors are not allowed to read unsolicited materials at all. If you are not an employee of Marvel Comics and employed as a writer, they can't read anything. So, again, being super naive and super, overzealous, I wrote a 1 page treatment for Brute Force, which I thought was pretty good, of course, not to blow smoke on my own ass, but I thought I put a lot of work into it. I mean, I read the 4 issues. Wasn't the best story ever, but, at any rate, I typed up a 1 page treatment, brought the books into the editor, said, "Hey man, I heard you guys talking about Brute Force. Here's my 4 issue. Here's the 4 issues. I got it off eBay." And they were actually really, really pleased. They said, "Wow, like, you actually were listening and, took it upon yourself to bring in these issues. That's pretty cool, man." And then I said, "Oh, by the way, here's a treatment that I wrote for the story." Now, he didn't shut me down immediately. He just smiled, gave me a, "Yeah, thanks, kid." and set the treatment on his desk, which was very nice of him to do because he could have just thrown it away or told me, hey, don't do that. And that's another lesson. Don't do anything for someone to have an expectation that they're going to do something back for you. That was a big lesson that I learned. Now, the guy was super cordial, very polite, took the treatment, set it on his desk, put it upside down so he couldn't see any of the words. And he didn't read it, which, he couldn't. Legally, he wasn't allowed to. But as time went on, I sat in the corner. Mind you, these offices were very, very small. And I sat right next to his desk, kind of like on this little makeshift seat, reading my comics, doing whatever task they want me to do. And over the next few days and next few weeks, that brute force treatment that he set on his desk started getting piled up with comic books, like his actual work that he was paid to do. And I just seen my dream get buried underneath all these comics. It just sat there and sat there for weeks and weeks on end. And so I was crushed. I was absolutely crushed because I made the mistake of doing something for somebody and expecting them to do something back to me in return. That sounds a little weird, pause, but you guys get what I'm saying. I went in with a very inflated ego, expecting for this editor to, one, read my treatment at all, knowing full well that, it was a high likelihood that he wouldn't. And he did. And that's completely fine because anybody who's out there, whether it be you're trying to pursue any dream or try to get a job or just doing something nice for somebody, don't expect anything in return. Do something out the kindness of your heart. So little 22-year-old me at the time, that was a big lesson to learn. But as time went on, it was one of those things that I said, I was just crushed. I was just absolutely floored that my dream was just going away. I dusted myself off, weeks went by for my internship and I just kind of, I wouldn't say forgot about it, but I kind of moved on. But there was this overbearing, like, hey, I'm failing. I'm nowhere near closer to my goal to becoming a Marvel Comics writer because my dream is literally buried under comics in this dude's office, ironically. So, I would go around kind of like internally moping. I would go into Axel Alonso's office to get approval for stuff. And I would just be thinking about my dream that's just falling apart. And Axel would just kind of look at me like, you all right, kid? And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. But it was cool. So one day I'm sitting in the office with the head editor, and he's, making his rounds, doing his job. And I look over at him and I say, hey, man, name redacted. And I said, can you tell me something? What would it take for somebody who isn't a Marvel Comics writer to start writing for Marvel Comics? Like, how do people even get into this company just trying to be writers? And he looked at me and he told me something that almost every single person in indie comics knows today, which is in order for us to find you, you got to make your own stuff. You got to be the person to bet on yourself and invest in yourself to make your own books. And even though I kind of knew that already a little bit, the fact that it came from an editor's mouth just kind of solidified it for me. It just said, yeah, that makes sense. Like, why would somebody invest time and money into a creative person that hasn't proven themselves to write? No matter how hungry you are or how determined you are, that's not worth its weight in gold. You have to have something that you yourself has made, you backed, you financed, you built an audience for, and then we'll come and find you. And so I thought about that for the remainder of my internship. And so by the time my internship ended, I made the decision that I would start doing my own comics. I didn't know when, I didn't know why, I didn't know how. Mind you, at the time, I'm 22 years old. I'm still in college. I'm flat broke. I'm working at Bed Bath and Beyond of all places, a company that doesn't even exist anymore. And I'm making $9 an hour, working about 3 days a week part time. So I started doing research. I educated myself. I said, okay, how much would it cost me to make a comic book? Where would I find an artist? How would I get it printed? How would I do any of this stuff? And so once the internship wrapped, I shook every single one of the editor's hands. I thanked them, and they pretty much said, best of luck. Go ahead, do what you need to do. So what I did was I thought to myself, okay, if I'm going to make this happen, I got to make it happen the right way. So I started writing my scripts for my own comics and ideas, all those ideas that what flowed to me about Marvel Comics characters, I started creating my own stories with my own characters. And then I sat and I stewed upon it and I started wondering, like, okay, cool. Like, how would I take this character and make him over here? What scenario would I put him in? And I started having fun. And that was the whole point. Like, have fun with what you're going to create. Don't do it in a sense that, hey, I'm looking to get something out of it other than the thrill of the chase, which led me to making my very first comic called Slurp. It's a questionable name, but it's a really good comic. Now, this particular copy is the very first copy of Slurp that was ever produced. And I wrote it myself. The artist was very, very excellent. He doesn't draw comics anymore, but I found him on Facebook. And you can even see that this was 2 years after my Marvel internship that this book actually materialized. Yeah, it's dated September 3rd, 2013. So nearly an entire 2 years later, I was able to actually produce my very first comic book. And what happened after this was a lot more heartbreak. A lot more heartbreak in a good sense because it was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of stops and starts. It was a lot of, hey, you're graduating from college. You're still working in retail. You don't have enough money to make the book the way that you want, but you just keep going and keep going and you have even more ideas. And so over the years, it made me produce another comic book called Syringe. Now, again, as you can see, this is a fully produced periodical book. And I was really, really proud of this. And this was probably done a year or 2 years after I produced Slurp. But what I'm getting at is that a lot of times creatives have these ideas in their head that they want to get something done and have it done fast so people can read it or see it or engage with it and tell them how awesome they are. Because back in the day, that's what I really wanted. I wanted to create stuff, but I wanted to create it and give it to people so people can say, oh, you're such a great writer, so they can basically validate what I was feeling. And as I gotten older over the past, 15 years, having, gotten married, having children, worked different jobs, traveling the world, you experience life and you think to yourself, okay, like, is validation really what I'm after? Or is that thrill of the chase, that creative thrill, really what I'm after? And I would say it's the latter for sure. Oftentimes, what we do is we press upon ourselves very, unrealistic goals. And one thing that Marvel taught me is that yes, comics will break your heart, but they'll replace it with an arc reactor. They will, 100%, if you have the balls, if you have the will to actually continue with what you claim is your dream. So for me, I've done a lot of different jobs. The job that I work right now, I work in tech. Absolutely love it. But even then, it's always, what's the next move? What's the next move? So for me, comics will always be a part of my life. You can see it on the shelf. Like, these are only like a quarter of the comic books I have. But creativity is something that can never be taken away from you. Whether, it gets buried on a pile of comics in a Marvel editor's office or, whatever. Like, take time to yourself and think about what exactly it is that you want, what it is that you're willing to sacrifice, and how hard you are willing to work to get it. Because oftentimes people will sit there and say, oh, I want to be a musician, I want to be a writer, I want to be this, I want to be that. But then the dream dies with just them saying it. But as it stands right now, I'm very happy to say that throughout the years, producing those comics, producing multiple different works of fiction, I'm in a place right now where I'm slowly been inching towards completing my first ever graphic novel, and that would be Slurp. And I'm happy to announce that it's actually finished. At least the artwork is. It is a 228-page graphic novel that was spawned out of the idea of the thrill of the chase. Do not sit back and wait for somebody to give you the opportunity. Take your time, keep your head down, work your ass off in order to get what you claim it is that you want. So for me, I'm looking at this as a testament of Marvel comics actually saved my creativity. It actually re-sparked things inside of me that I didn't even know I had. Because that old Jack Kirby quote that comics will break your heart, yes, but anything you love will break your heart. A relationship with your partner will break your heart, but do you ever stop loving in general? You know, you might fall out of love with a career or something else, but that doesn't mean you stop going. So, if anything, take this as an opportunity to buckle down and focus. Now, just another last note too. That doesn't mean that it's going to work out for you. Not everything works out, and if it does, it doesn't work out instantaneously. This book, Syringe, I actually did 4 different versions of this story, all issues number one. And the reason why I did that, because one, I'm a Taurus, I'm super, super stubborn. But at the same time, I felt like I had an idea that it was so infectious, and I couldn't put it down. But the funny thing is, once I did Slurp, this book got way more of a reception from the few people who did read it and said, wow, this detective story you came up with is a horror noir story. It was just way more engaging for the few people who actually did read it and did give me feedback. And then the feedback that I got on this book was actually mid. People said, the story is okay, but we don't really know where it's going. But that's the interesting part. Both these books are roughly the same amount of pages. It's just that this story connected with readers more, and this one didn't. And you also have to think to yourself as well. Like, if you have a story idea and you're obsessed with it, it might need some work. That might not be the final version of your story. You might need to go and redo it. So, like I said, I did 4 different versions of this story in the number one with small tweaks to it. But the funny thing is, I decided to put this story on the shelf for many, many years in favor of this one. And this one is now completed. This is an entire graphic novel with beautiful art and a completely new writer, or a completely new artist whose artwork complements the story 5, 10 times over. And there's no shade to the other artist. He was excellent, but it's like that time, that heartbreak that I had to go through from the Marvel Comics internship to finding the money to produce the comic to finding a artist to do it, and then having breaks in between. I did 3 issues of this book before this newer version was complete. So there's actually 3 issues of this that exist. And then when I decided to go back to this book after taking years of hiatus, I went back and the artist said, "You know what, buddy? I'm done with comics. I don't even work in comics anymore." That was another heartbreak. I'm like, I loved working with this artist. Like, he was excellent. And there was nothing I could do to convince him to return to the book because he decided that, it just wasn't in his heart anymore. So I had to redo it. So I picked up where I left off on this particular book with issue 4. And the art was so different and so more bold and powerful. And again, no shade to the artist of this particular version of the book. But I said to myself, if I'm going to make this book and this story as concise and as good for readers as possible, I'm going to have to take more time, more money, more effort to make a complete version of this book with the same artist. So that's exactly what I did. And it took me years to do, years to complete. I started in 2020. We just wrapped early in 2026, and there's still so much work to do. I'm having an animation made for the book and promotion for it, but I'll get into all of that in later videos. But the point is, comics will break your heart, but there's nothing wrong with a broken heart. A broken heart can be mended if you put the effort in, if you don't, rest on your laurels, if you don't sit back and feel sorry for yourself that things didn't work out the way that you intended to. Because I think what Jack Kirby meant to say, and I don't want to speak for Jack Kirby, but this is just a lesson that I take in that particular quote, is that comics will break your heart, but they will also teach you how to love again if you choose for them to. So with that being said, thank you all for listening to me blab about how terrible of a Marvel intern I was way back when. I'll have more ideas and stories coming to you guys, but thank you for your time. Keep reading and keep making comics. See you later. And Jack Kirby grew up in this building right here, all the way back in the 1930s. Hard to believe.